The second corpus of scriptural writings in the Christian canon comprises the books that are poetic and didactic in character. In the poetic books, the people sing praises to their God and address their petitions and complaints to him, as well as their thanks for the benefactions they receive, and above all, they express their hopes for the coming of Christ. The didactic books, on the other hand, are a treasury of divine wisdom, which will be identified by the Christian Church with the second person of the Holy Trinity. For wisdom sits by the throne of God, precedes time and creation, and is a breath of the power of God and an emanation of the pure glory of the Almighty, a reflection of eternal light and a spotless mirror of the activity of God in the image of his goodness. Finally, the Eastern Christian canon concludes with the prophetic books. The content of these books is considered by the Church principally as announcing in advance the coming of Christ, and the various books are arranged in such a way that the image of the awaited Redeemer becomes gradually more clear. Thus, the Christian Old Testament ends, according to the classification of the works in the editions that follow the Orthodox tradition, with the Book of Daniel, in which the resurrection of the dead is proclaimed, and the figure of the Son of Man is described through a magnificent vision as coming with the clouds of heaven. And he was presented to the eternal God. He was crowned king and given power and glory, so that all people of every nation and race would serve him. He will rule forever, and his kingdom is eternal, never to be destroyed. Precisely the same title, Son of Man, will be used in the very next book of the Christian Bible, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, every time Jesus speaks of himself. Nonetheless, the writers of the Church were fully conscious of the fact that by quoting the Septuagint text, they were offering a translated text with all the shortcomings that this might involve, something they never tried to disguise. Indicative for this argument are the views of Gregory of Nyssa, who, in order to counter the alleged intelligibility of the Old Testament, stressed that difficulties in understanding the Old Testament text were due to deficient renderings of Hebrew syntax into Greek, and he pointed out that the problem would have been solved if those who leveled the charges had had sufficient knowledge of Hebrew. John Chrysostom shared the same view, highlighting that the reason for the difficulty in understanding the Old Testament lay in problems of semantic transfer from the source text into another language. Much later, during the 9th century, Patriarch Photius returned to the subject in question and enumerated 10 shortcomings of the translation vis-a-vis the original text. These examples demonstrate not only that the Church did not reject the original Hebrew Old Testament text, but also that the Church writers in fact frequently referred to it when trying to find solutions to hermeneutic problems or to elucidate ambiguities in the Septuagint. The extant tables for transcribing the Hebrew alphabet into Greek dated from the 4th to the 10th century lead to the same conclusion. It is noteworthy that in these tables, the recording of the alphabet is done by the teaching method of the time, namely memorization, a fact which testifies to the interest by church officials in the teaching and learning of Hebrew. A typical example is enough to show how ecclesiastical writers attempt to deal with problems arising from misinterpreted passages of the Septuagint text. Procopius of Gaza, AD 465 to 527, when translating Isaiah 9:6, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, quotes the various translations of the passage from the ancient translators, Symmachus, Aquila, and Theodosion. It is interesting that Procopius not only cited the various translations of the passage, but also attempted to interpret them. Thus, he attributed the omission of the name of God by the 3 latter translators to psychological reasons. They were odd to place the name of God to a born child. He went even further and, in order to defend the Septuagint, went back to the original Hebrew text. After having presented several passages where the Hebrew word El is rendered by God, he reached the conclusion that the Septuagint translators were correct in translating El Gibor as Mighty God. The same practice was followed by Procopius in all his work. These items, besides the demonstrative character of their presentation, suffice to support the view that the Church during its first millennium did not tie itself to a specific textual tradition of the Old Testament, nor did it ever reject the original Hebrew text. It was for purely practical reasons that it used the Septuagint text. The examples of Origen, AD 185 to 254, and Eusebius, AD 265 to 340, who paid special attention to the later translations of the Hebrew text into Greek, confirmed the truth of this claim. Origen included, as is well known, all the translations that were in use during his time, along with the Hebrew text twice, in Hebrew letters and in Greek letters, in his great synoptic compilation, the Hexapla, while Eusebius considered them as divinely inspired, as that of the Septuagint, and their study necessary to clarify what the Septuagint left obscure. As he characteristically states, if somewhere it is necessary, we do not refrain from the versions of newer interpreters that were made after it, and which the Jews prefer to use, in order to present the truth in a safer way from all sides. The Great Schism and its aftermath. The Great Schism between the Eastern and Western churches and the tragic events for the East that followed, e.g. the Crusades and the Turkish domination, left no room for the discussions about the text of the books of the Old Testament. Moreover, a millennium of Christianity was long enough for the consolidation of local traditions. The issue of the Old Testament text was raised again in the West during the 16th century because of the Protestant Reformation. A century later, it reappeared in the East, but under completely different circumstances from those in the past. In the West, the zeal of the Reformers for a return to the authentic sources of faith led the Protestant churches to recognize the Hebrew Old Testament text as the only authoritative one, and therefore to adopt the narrow Jewish canon. The books not included in this canon, but endorsed by the Western Church, were labeled Apocrypha, and the rest Pseudepigrapha. In spite of this development, and notwithstanding the deprecatory label Apocrypha, Lutheran tradition did not altogether proscribe the reading of these books, which to date are often included in editions of the Bible as addenda. At the opposite end of the spectrum, other Protestant traditions, such as Calvinists and Puritans of Scotland, took a more rigid stance, something that led to the famous Apocrypha controversy within the British Bible Society, resulting in the adoption, for a period of time, of the narrow Jewish canon by the Society. The attitude of Protestantism occasioned the definitive solution of the problem of canon in the Roman Catholic Church. The Council of Trent, in its decree Sacrosancta of 1546, essentially endorsed the ancient Roman tradition by officially accepting the broad Old Testament canon, with the exception of 1 Ezra and 3 Maccabees. The books included in the Jewish canon were labeled canonical, and the rest were designated deuterocanonical, having equal authority with the former. The First Vatican Synod, 1869 to 1870, ratified this decision, thereby definitively concluding this issue for the Roman Catholic Church. In the Orthodox Church, the matter of the Old Testament text was raised again, not as an internal problem, but as a reflection of the related discussions that were going on in the West. By the end of the 16th century, many Orthodox were going to the West to study theology. Western theology, however, at the time was being shaped to a large degree by the confrontations between Protestants and Catholics, and many Orthodox theologians were influenced by that trend. Thus, one may observe the phenomenon of Orthodox theologians turning against Roman Catholicism using arguments that reveal Protestant influence, or vice versa. They turned against Protestantism using doctrinal positions colored by Catholicism. As representatives of this practice, Metrophanes Critopoulos, Patriarch of Alexandria, Cyril Lucaris, Patriarch of Constantinople, and Dositheus, Patriarch of Jerusalem, may be mentioned. Around the end of the 16th century, the Patriarch of Alexandria, Meletius Pigus, sent to Poland the eminent theologian and clergyman Cyril Lucaris of Crete, in response to the demand of Orthodox folk there, to assist them in their struggle against the activities of the Jesuits, an event which led to the formation of the First Uniatic Church, Synod of Brest, in 1596. In this struggle, Cyril Lucaris requested support from Protestant communities in Poland. Later on, Lucaris, as a Patriarch of Alexandria, sent Metrophanes Critopoulos, who later succeeded him as Patriarch, to England, Germany, and Switzerland, mainly to study Protestant theology and church policy. Protestant influence on the theology of Metrophanes Critopoulos is apparent in his Confession of Faith, which he compiled in 1625, and by which he tried to enlighten Protestants about the content of the Orthodox faith, and especially to ally them with them against the Roman Catholics. 4 years later, in 1629, Cyril Lucaris, as Patriarch of Constantinople, published in Geneva his own Confession of Faith, characterized by vehemence against Roman Catholics, In his confession, the Patriarch adopted clearly Calvinistic positions, a matter that caused alarm among the Orthodox. In reaction to Lucaris, a series of local synods against Protestantism were held. In addition to the synodical resolutions, Lucaris's work gave rise to new confessions of faith, such as those of Peter Mogila, Bishop of Kiev, and Dositheus, Patriarch of Jerusalem. Especially in the latter, Roman Catholic influence is evidence, as the Patriarch defended the doctrine of transubstantiation, the teaching concerning the sanctification of divine justice, and, to some degree, the use of indulgences. Moreover, he forbade the teaching of the scriptures by non-professionals. In the same line were the developments in Russian Orthodoxy, where both the theological views expressed on the text of the Old Testament and the synodical resolutions were fueled by the confrontation of Catholicism with Protestantism. As is known, Christianity was introduced in Russia at the end of the 10th century from Byzantium, but the Bible and the other church books came from Bulgaria in their Bulgarian translation from Greek. Although there are indications that the Hebrew text of the Old Testament was not unknown in the Slavic manuscript tradition, at the end of the 17th century the Russian Holy Synod declared the translation from the Septuagint as the only true version of the Holy Scripture. The same approach was followed by the Russian ecclesiastical authorities until the last edition of the Slavonic Bible, the Elizabethan Bible, in 1751. The rising after the 17th century of the issue of the Old Testament text in the East coincides with an era during which many peoples from the East, being Orthodox in majority, begin, following the effects of the Enlightenment, to formulate a specific perception of national awareness and seek their independence from the Ottoman Empire. The main requirement for this independence from the tyranny of the Sultan was, according to the views of the Enlighteners, the intellectual awakening of these peoples that could only be achieved through education, but also through reformation of outdated social institutions such as the Church. Adamantios Koreis, one of the most prominent representatives of the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment, proposed the introduction of the teaching of the Hebrew language in the schools that would be established after the liberation of the Greek nation from the Ottoman yoke. In 1808, he turned to the British Bible Society, asking them to provide a Bible translation in a language that could be easily understood by the people. The British Bible Society responded immediately to his request by republishing in 1810 a revised version of the 1636 New Testament translation of the monk Maximos Kalliopolitis. However, the work of another representative of the same intellectual movement was much more important. It was the work of Archimandrite Neophytos Vambas, who worked on one of the most notable and long-standing translations of the entire Bible from the original texts, Hebrew and Greek, in vernacular Greek a few years after the establishment of the Hellenic kingdom. In parallel with these developments, the subject of the Old Testament text is raised again in Russia with the founding of the Russian Bible Society in 1812. Two scholars, the priest Gerasim Pavsky, and the professor of St. Petersburg Theological Academy, and the Archimandrite Filaret Drozdov, translated for the first time the Old Testament from Hebrew into Russian. But even in this case, the Holy Synod ordered the most important features of the Slavonic text to be introduced into the Old Testament translation. But the whole effort did not last long, because in 1826 the Russian Bible Society was closed down. Either way, the views that were formulated in that period, even the synodical resolutions, were fueled by the confrontation of Catholicism with Protestantism. They therefore cannot claim to be binding solutions of the problem for the Orthodox Church. The issue of the biblical text in modern times. With the establishment of the new Greek state, the issue of Scripture was placed on an entirely new footing for Greek Orthodoxy. Therefore, in order to understand the issue, what is needed is a careful analysis of the era and especially of the place of the Orthodox Church within the new Greek state. The establishment of the new Greek state and almost all the Balkan states after the fall of the Ottoman Empire was founded on the principles of the Enlightenment, which stressed the importance of the law as the foundation of an ideal state, without, however, placing a similar emphasis on other principles, such as those of justice, equality, and freedom. In this phase of the Church, which, due to its struggles during the War of Independence, enjoyed the confidence of the people, was used by the central government as an instrument of instruction for people. Consequently, the people obeyed the law and the authorities. The Church, which knew from its tradition that all power derives from God, adapted itself easily to this role. Thereby, being Orthodox became a feature of Greek identity. Whoever was not Orthodox could not be a true Greek. This situation was intensified by the arrival in Greece of the first king, Otto von Wittelsbach of Bavaria. Otto was crowned as King of Greece by the grace of God. The Church now became the Church of Greece, separated from the ecumenical patriarchate, and its Holy Synod became the highest ecclesiastical authority of the state, under obligation to legitimate the authority of the king. Theocratic interpretation of history became the basis for the understanding of social reality. This situation hardly changed under the next king, George I, when the form of the regime changed to become a democracy governed by a king. George derived his authority from the nation. However, the nation was now described in terms borrowed from the Old Testament as a chosen people of God and a holy nation. Greeks were the people of God, who spoke in their language and had invested them with a special mission to preserve orthodoxy undefiled and to spread it to other peoples, so that they might also be saved. George I was no longer the king of Greece, but the king of the Greeks, who were now to be understood as the holy nation of God. In this way, the Church was identified with the nation and the national aspirations. In the support of the Church's role in Greek society, an important part was played already from the time of the Turkish occupation by the so-called missionary movement. The first Protestant missionaries came to Greece during 1810. Initially, they were favorably received. Indeed, ecumenical patriarchs such as Cyril VI in 1814 and Gregory V in 1819 displayed a positive attitude to their work, and especially toward their efforts to distribute the scriptures. Unfortunately, these evangelical missionaries had a completely erroneous understanding of the Eastern churches. They considered the Orthodox Church as a church long dead, of which nothing remained except her ritual reminiscent of idolatry more than of Christian worship. Thus, they turned their missionary activity not toward Muslims or infidel, but toward the Orthodox Christians. The first Old Testament translation from Hebrew into the modern Greek was published in 1834. The widespread distribution of the translation by Protestants forced the Orthodox Church to be on the defensive, with especially negative consequences for the spread of Scripture in Greece. As a result, the divine inspiration of the Septuagint was now stressed, and one of the tasks of the Holy Synod became the preservation of the New Testament text in the language which God spoke. The anxious effort of Konstantinou Oikonomos to prove, in a voluminous work, the divine inspiration of the Septuagint is a typical example. Despite its failure, its effort constituted by its massive undertaking a monument to the trend that prevailed. The Church became the self-declared protector of the national traditions, including those of ancient Greece, and because of the identification of the nation with the Church, as stated earlier, every action turned against the Church was now considered anti-national. It is noteworthy that from 1911 onward, every constitution of Greece proscribed the translation of Scripture and proselytism. Protestants reacted to this situation with aggressive proselytizing toward the Orthodox Church, something that was in any case part of their tradition and their missionary understanding. This resulted in such a wave of suspicion that every activity of Protestants, even today, is regarded by the Orthodox Church as proselytizing. Perhaps the best proof of the political nature of the confrontation regarding the translation of Scripture may be seen in the incidents that took place in Athens in November of 1901, well known as Evangeliaka. The whole matter began with the desire by Queen Olga, who was of Russian descent, to boost the religious sentiment of the people by encouraging the translation of the New Testament into modern Greek, a task that was begun in 1898 and completed within a year by her secretary, Iola Soumaki, under the supervision of her uncle, Professor Pandazidis. Interest in the case is centered on the fact that the Metropolitan of Athens, Procopius, although aware of the project since its inception, failed to raise any objection to the Queen. When, however, she asked for the approval of the Holy Synod for a translation, things changed radically. Newspapers presented the matter as a devilish plan by the Slavs, aimed at creating strife among the people and religious feuds that would help win over the Macedonian Greeks by the Bulgarian Exarchate. After this fury, the Holy Synod, in March of 1899, denied the request of the Queen for approval. When she asked for arbitration by the ecumenical patriarch, she again received a negative answer. Tempers became frayed, and the situation got out of control when later on the newspaper Acropolis began to publish excerpts from another translation, done by Alexandros Pallas in hyperdemonic Greek. Once again, the reaction involved no theological argumentation. In a resolution of students, there appeared the phrase, "ridicule of the most precious national treasures," and professors of theology published a memorandum demanding that the publication be stopped. Opposition newspapers such as Scrip, Kairoi, and Embros expressed similar sentiments, and by the beginning of October 1901, they accused the supporters of Demotic of being godless, traitors, tools of the Slavs, and recipients of bribes in Russian rubles. During the demonstrations and the unrest which followed on November 5th, 6th, and especially 8th of the year 1901, the argumentation was again purely political. The chief demand, in addition, of course, to the excommunication of the translators, was the resignation of the government of the Prime Minister Theotokos, with the common slogans of "Down with the Slav woman" and "Long live the heir." The result of the unrest was 11 dead, 3 students and 8 civilians, and nearly 80 wounded. After the incidents, the chief slogan again was "Down with the government of murderers." It is noteworthy that the target of the entire affair was not the translation itself, but the Queen. This is evidenced by the fact that although the translation of Queen Olga had been withdrawn and Pallas's translation had become the reason for the incidents, nevertheless the ire of demonstrators was turned exclusively against the Queen. The encyclical of the Holy Synod, however, in which the translations of the Gospel were deplored, is especially interesting. Here, too, the absence of theological argumentation is noteworthy. The encyclical begins by declaring that from the time when the Gospel was written until the middle of the 17th century, no one had ever thought to translate it. The document then refers to the translation of 1629, regarded as the work of a Dutch Calvinist priest, and to its failure. The Holy Synod boasted that the Greek Church was the only church that was privileged to be in possession of the original text. It viewed the newer translations as being in a language terribly vulgar, which shamefully and scandalously defaces the modest beauty of the divinely inspired original text. The sole theological reason cited against translating the Gospel was the danger of perverting the original meaning, which had developed and formulated into dogmas by the ecumenical synods. For the understanding of the Gospel, the study of the interpretations of the Fathers was recommended. Nevertheless, the practical but very real problem of how to gain access to the works of the Fathers and how to understand them does not appear to have preoccupied the Holy Synod, nor was it demonstrated just how a Gospel translation might pervert the doctrines formulated by ecumenical synods. The encyclical continued by referring to the practice of the Church up to that time of not translating Scripture, even during the period of Turkish domination, when linguistic barriers created particular difficulties for the understanding of the original. The main argument of the Synod was that, now that our national language is advanced and slowly but surely and happily is on the course of recapturing its ancient acme and magnificence, there was no need for a translation. Thus the encyclical concluded with disapproval and condemnation of every translation. This encyclical, although making no reference to the translation of the Old Testament, has nonetheless great importance for the issue examined here, since it verifies most strikingly the notion that the Church's hierarchy of that time as being defenders of national tradition and of the Greek language. The situation changed in Russia under the rule of Alexander II at the initiative of Filaret, Metropolitan of Moscow. So the so-called synodical version of the Bible was first published in 1876. The Old Testament translation into Russian was based on the Masoretic text, but it absorbed all the eclecticism of the Slavonic tradition, combining the Greek and the Hebrew original. Conclusion. From the whole study of the matter, one may draw the conclusion that the options and practices of the recent past cannot serve as a tool for solving the problem of the place of the original Old Testament text in the Orthodox Church. But neither should the practice of the ancient Church be used as a basis for the solution of the problem, since, as has been underscored repeatedly, the understanding of the Scripture in more recent times differs radically from that of the first Christian millennium. A survey of contemporary Orthodox writings validates this view. When reference is made to the ecumenical and free spirit of orthodoxy, the translation work of Cyril and Methodius is praised at the same time as the West is condemned because of its doctrine concerning sacred languages. On the other hand, when the modern scripture translations are mentioned, the role of the church in the preservation of the Greek language, the importance of the text of the Septuagint, and the role of missionaries are emphasized. It is obvious, therefore, that today there is a need for a completely new and sober handling of the problem with purely scientific criteria, but also with a sense of responsibility. Such an approach cannot disregard the literary, religious, and theological value of the Septuagint. Its literary value has to do with the fact that it preserves a text based on a Hebrew parent text that is more ancient by many centuries than the Masoretic text, the latter beginning to be systematized after the 5th century and completed as late as the 14th century. This fact offers an important comparative advantage to the Septuagint, the testimony of which may be valuable as much for the critical restoration of the Masoretic text as for the clarification of its difficult passages. The religious significance of the Septuagint, however, should not be overlooked either, provided it is regarded as the Holy Bible of the Church rather than a literary production of antiquity. From this point of view, it is indisputable that the Septuagint constituted the Bible of the undivided Church, the text on which the apostles and the Church Fathers depended in order to present their theology, the text which facilitated beyond any other the spread of Christianity in the Greco-Roman world, the text which assumed the role of the original for the multitude of other ecclesiastical translations and became the source of inspiration for the hymnography and iconography of the Church, but also as a witness of the particular hermeneutic approach which was dominant at the time of Christianity's emergence. The Septuagint has a special importance, from a theological point of view, for the understanding of the New Testament. All the foregoing combined to make the Septuagint text invaluable for the theological research and religious consciousness of the Orthodox Christians, without in any way justifying a theological or literary underestimation of the original Hebrew. Moreover, in addition to the value the Septuagint may have, the possibility of an important divergence of its text from the original due to likely copying errors or translation tendencies should not be at any event overlooked. Therefore, to the extent that, as has been argued, nothing today compels the Orthodox Church to favor a text of a particular form, it must embrace as its own heritage both texts, the Hebrew and the Septuagint, regarding their study and research. The re-establishment of the Russian Bible Society in the 1990s and the transformation in 1992 of the British and Foreign Bible Society office that operated in Greece to an independent national Bible society under the name Hellenic Bible Society contributed significantly to the realization of the hierarchies of local churches. This need. I don't know. Okay. The one thing that sticks out to me is the thing that he offhand referenced about the Septuagint being a translation of an earlier, now lost Hebrew original. And that the Masoretic text, which comes much later, like in the 5th century, that edits out those books that are not basically all those books that are clearly Christological, in order to, as almost a polemic against those Jews that were Christians. The fact that that's almost said offhandedly, I think is problematic. You have to acknowledge the extent to which possible differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text are genuinely due to the Hebrews changing things, editing things out to make them less Christological. Because there's a lot in the Septuagint that is clearly Christological. And so that's what I would wonder, is this, and also like even it was commonplace to translate girl as virgin. Girl and virgin are almost synonymous, since to become a woman is to have had intercourse, basically. And so the difference in translation is also due to a difference in understanding at different points in history, where even earlier in this book, when he was talking about the not in this book, in the other book we're reading, in Coogan's book. So not earlier, but rather in a different book. It talks about where is it? The Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish. No, not that book. Maybe it is. Or was it not Enuma Elish? Was it actually the Bible, where it talks about Eve becoming a woman? I'm not sure exactly where, but that after having intercourse, you become a woman. And so the translation of girl and virgin at that point are synonymous with one another. You can't have a girl that isn't a virgin. Otherwise, she's not a girl anymore. She's become a woman. And so, just things like that don't land quite squarely for me with this. That the Masoretic texts rendering ambiguous some things that are very clear in the Septuagint speaks to a motivation in the interpreters or in the translators or in the compilers to edit out those things that were clearly Christological in nature. Anyway, those are my thoughts on this. So I don't have enough experience with biblical studies in this way to comment beyond that. So that's all for now.